Chapter 1: Premonition. The federal prison, Sunny Canyon in Arizona, resembled a scorching skillet thrown in the very center of the desert. The July sun had turned its concrete walls into heat radiators, and the metal handrails burned the hands of careless inmates. In this inferno, prison guard Alex Baker, 39 years old, felt drops of sweat tracing wet paths down his spine, soaking into his dark blue uniform. Baker had an aquiline profile, closely cropped graying temples, and eyes the color of an overcast sky, calm, impenetrable, having seen so many human fates that they had learned to distinguish the slightest shades of deception. 15 years of impeccable service had made him a legend among the staff. Inmates respected him for his honesty, superiors for his professionalism, and his wife Rachel for his unwavering loyalty to his principles. Rachel Baker, a fragile 32-year-old woman with a mane of copper-red hair, worked as a nurse at the same prison. When she walked down the corridors, the air seemed to fill with the scent of her peach perfume. Inmates followed her with their eyes but never allowed themselves anything inappropriate. The silent presence of her husband guard worked better than any disciplinary action. No one could have imagined that this woman with gentle hands and a soft smile would become a key figure in a story that would shake the entire justice system of the state and change the fates of several people, including Daniel Foster, an unjustly convicted financial analyst, and Marcus Johnson, an Afghanistan veteran who dreamed of only one thing: saying goodbye to his dying mother. Alex noticed changes in Rachel's behavior in early July, when the temperature in the shade exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, and the air conditioners in the administrative block were working at their limit. She began staying at the medical unit until late evening, became absent-minded, often froze lost in her thoughts, and startled when he called out to her. At first, he attributed it to fatigue. Working in a prison hospital required not only professional skills but also emotional resilience. But gradually, a troubling chill began to grow in his soul. At breakfast, she no longer met his gaze, and their evening conversations on the veranda, which used to last until the dead of night, had turned into exchanges of perfunctory phrases. It was as if a glass wall had grown between them, transparent but insurmountable. This morning, Alex decided to start by checking the medical unit's visitor log. In the silence of the administrative office, the turning of pages seemed deafeningly loud. His attention was drawn to a strange pattern. Inmate 64,328, Daniel Foster, serving a 25-year sentence for financial fraud, had visited the medical unit 12 times in the last 2 weeks. Headache, sleep problems, high blood pressure. The diagnoses were so generic that they seemed made up, especially considering that Foster, as far as Alex remembered, had previously been in iron health. Coincidence? Perhaps, but all these visits happened to be during Rachel's shifts. Baker carefully closed the journal and pressed it to his chest like a shield. He began systematically observing his wife during her shifts. She moved differently now, as if music that only she could hear set the rhythm of her steps. When Foster appeared in the medical unit, Rachel's fingers fluttered over medical charts with a special grace, and golden sparks flashed in her eyes. Between them arose electricity, invisible but tangible, like an approaching thunderstorm. At the same time, but in another wing of the prison, Warden Victor Price was meeting with inmate Marcus Johnson in his spacious office. The office seemed like an oasis of luxury amid prison austerity: leather chair, antique desk, crystal water carafe. A powerful air conditioner created artificial coolness, and heavy curtains kept out the scorching Arizona sun. Price, a stocky 57-year-old man with inflamed eyelids and a constantly moist forehead, resembled a predator temporarily taking human form. He leafed through the personal file of the inmate sitting opposite him, clicking his tongue as if he had found something interesting there. Marcus Johnson, a 37-year-old African-American with military bearing and the eyes of a cornered animal, sat motionless with his hands on his knees. Muscular arms with intricate burn scars, A reminder of an exploded armored personnel carrier in the Afghan mountains betrayed his military background. 25 years for armed bank robbery. That was the price of a desperate attempt to find money for his mother's treatment, his only close person. Now, after 5 years of imprisonment, he had received a letter. She had less than a month to live. "I've studied your case, Johnson," Price began, setting aside the folder as if he had just finished reading a boring novel. "Commendable behavior. No violations for 5 years. Work in the laundry. Visits to the prison chaplain." He paused, examining the inmate like an entomologist studying a rare butterfly. "How is your mother?" At the mention of his mother, Marcus's face flinched as if a shadow had passed over it. "Dying, sir. Lung cancer. The hospice said, a few weeks, no more." Price nodded with an expression of practiced sympathy. "I could help you see her. Not just a visit, early release, for exemplary behavior, of course." He paused, watching hope flare in the inmate's eyes. "But I need one favor in return." Johnson leaned forward, instinctively clenching and unclenching his fists. "What favor, sir?" Inmate 64328, Daniel Foster. Price took a photograph from his desk drawer and placed it in front of Johnson. "I need him to disappear. An accident, suicide, I don't care, just without unnecessary noise." Marcus stared at the photograph for a long time, which showed a man around 40 with penetrating gray eyes and a barely noticeable smile, as if he knew some secret unavailable to the photographer. "Why him specifically?" Johnson's voice sounded hoarse, as if the words were getting stuck in his throat. "That's not your concern," Price cut him off. "Your concern is to do it cleanly. In return, you'll get a visit with your mother and a reduced sentence. Think hard. Another 12.5 years here or freedom in a couple of months. The choice is obvious, isn't it?" Marcus was silent, not taking his eyes off Foster's photograph. In 5 years of prison life, he had seen a lot: beatings, knife fights, death. But it was one thing to witness violence, and quite another to coldly plan a murder. The image of his mother lying on a hospital bed with oxygen tubes in her nose overshadowed everything else. "I agree," he finally uttered in a low voice that contained the cold desperation of a man backed into a corner. "Excellent choice." Price leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. "Tomorrow you'll be transferred to his cell. The formal reason: overcrowding in your block. You'll get to know him, gain his trust, but don't drag it out too long. Time is passing and your mother doesn't have much of it." The next morning, Marcus Johnson stood in front of cell 307, where Daniel Foster was held, with a tattered Bible book and a bag of personal belongings. The guard unlocked the bars, and Johnson stepped over the threshold of his new dwelling. Foster sat on the lower bunk, immersed in reading a paperback book, a worn volume of Dostoevsky. He looked up at his new cellmate, a calm, appraising gaze of a man accustomed to analyzing not only numbers but also people. "Hi," Foster said, setting aside the book. "I'm Dan." "Marcus," Johnson replied, tossing his bag onto the upper bunk. The cell turned out to be surprisingly neat, with a carefully made bed and a small table where books stood strictly by size. Photographs hung on the wall: a middle-aged man with 2 teenagers against the backdrop of an ocean, the same children but younger, holding seashells in their hands, a woman with a sad smile. "Transferring from D Block?" Foster inquired. "Yes, every inch is accounted for there now." Marcus began arranging his things, covertly studying his cellmate. He looked for something in him that might explain Price's special interest, but saw only a tired middle-aged man with intelligent eyes and the manners of a university professor. Foster meanwhile got up and approached the wash basin. His movements were unhurried, precise, the movements of a man who had learned to conserve energy in confined spaces. After rinsing his face, he dried off with a faded towel and turned to Johnson. "What are you in for, if it's not a secret?" "Armed robbery, 25 years." Marcus sat down on the bunk, observing Foster's reaction. "And you?" Financial machinations, also a quarter century. Foster smirked, but something dark, painful flashed in his eyes. Funny coincidence, isn't it? You took 10,000 with a gun, and I, as the prosecution claims, stole millions without leaving the office. And the sentence is the same. In Foster's intonation, Marcus caught bitterness. Something in his words, in the way he mentioned the prosecution, made Johnson alert. He remembered Price's insinuating voice and felt an anxious sensation forming inside, as if he had entered a game whose rules were unknown to him. A metallic clang came from the corridor. A guard was making his rounds. Foster returned to his book, and Johnson lay on his bunk, staring at the gray ceiling crisscrossed with fine cracks. He was to spend a lot of time in this cell, studying the man he was supposed to kill. He closed his eyes and saw his mother's face, worn out by illness. "Forgive me, Mom," he soundlessly whispered. At this time, Alex Baker continued his unofficial investigation. During his daily rounds, he noticed Rachel slipping into the medical unit half an hour before her shift started. Through the glass partition, he saw her passing something to Foster. At first glance, a standard blister pack of pills. But there was something unusual about this gesture, too personal, like a handshake between conspirators. Catching his gaze, Rachel startled and hurriedly turned to the medicine cabinet. Foster, however, maintained enviable composure. He thanked the nurse and unhurriedly headed for the exit, as if savoring every second of free movement. Passing by Baker, he nodded slightly, as he always did when meeting the guard. But today, Alex noticed something new in his eyes, either a challenge or a secret superiority. After the inmate left, Alex entered the medical unit. Rachel was still standing by the cabinet, pretending to sort medications. "What did you give him?" he asked, trying to make his voice sound ordinary. "A sleep medication," she answered without turning around. "Ambien, he has trouble sleeping." "As do half the inmates in this oven," Alex noted. "Why is he receiving special attention?" Rachel finally turned to her husband. A flash of irritation appeared in her green eyes. "Are you spying on me?" "It's my job to watch everything that happens behind these walls." "I work here too, Alex, and I know my professional duties." Icy notes sounded in her voice. She had never spoken to him in such a tone before. Something had broken between them, something important, perhaps irretrievably. "Foster is not an ordinary inmate," she continued more softly, as if trying to smooth over the tension that had arisen. "He's an educated man. You can talk to him about more than just illnesses and medications. Besides, I'm sure he's innocent." "They all say that," Alex muttered. "No, this is different. I've reviewed his case documents. There are so many inconsistencies. The charges are built on the testimony of one witness, and the main evidence disappeared immediately after the sentencing." "You shouldn't get involved in this," Baker cut her off. "Just do your job." "That's exactly what I'm doing," Rachel retorted and demonstratively returned to her notes. Alex stood a while longer, looking at his wife's tense back, then silently left. This brief dialogue left a bitter taste in his mouth. He felt like he was losing Rachel, and that was much more frightening than any prison violations. At the end of the corridor, he ran into Price. The prison warden looked unusually animated, as if he had just made a profitable deal. "Ah, Baker," he greeted the guard. "How are things in the medical unit? All quiet?" There was something in his tone that made Alex internally tense. It seemed that Price was well aware of what was happening and was observing the developments with an unhealthy interest. "Everything's in order, sir," Baker replied, carefully studying the warden's face. "Good," he nodded. "Keep an eye on things there, especially on that Foster. He visits the medical unit too often." With these words, Price departed, leaving Alex in even greater confusion. Something was definitely happening behind the walls of Sunny Canyon Prison, some big game, and his wife, it seemed, had become its unwitting participant. That same evening, Foster and Johnson were sitting in their cell. Lights out hadn't been called yet, and the prison block filled with the usual evening sounds, muffled conversations, the creaking of bunks, the clinking of dishes. Somewhere in a distant cell, someone was quietly singing the blues, the hoarse voice sounding like an old record. Foster sat on his bunk, leaning against the wall and examining some small object in his hands. Johnson, pretending to read a magazine, covertly observed his cellmate. In the dim light of the prison lamp, he noticed that Foster was holding a small paper note. "You know, Marcus," Foster suddenly spoke without raising his eyes, "I'm actually innocent." Johnson lowered the magazine. Something in his cellmate's voice made him listen. "I was the financial director of the Apollo Investment Company," Foster continued. "One day I discovered serious manipulations in the reporting. The company was actually incurring losses, but the documents showed astronomical profits. Nathaniel Harrison, my boss, forced me to sign these false reports to inflate the stock price before selling the controlling stake. Naturally, after the deal, an independent audit discovered the real state of affairs, and when everything came to light." Foster fell silent, crumpled the note, and hid it in his pocket. "Why didn't you refuse to sign?" asked Johnson. "He threatened. Not me, my family. I have a wife and 2 children, or rather had. My wife couldn't bear the disgrace and divorced me a year after the sentencing." There wasn't the expected bitterness in Foster's voice, only fatigue. Marcus felt something inside constrict from unexpected compassion. He remembered Price's words about an accident and thought that the prison warden clearly had a specific reason for wanting to get rid of Foster. "And now I have a chance to prove my innocence," Foster unexpectedly continued. "I managed to find documents that can confirm my version. I just need to get out to freedom." He looked intently at Johnson, as if assessing whether he could be trusted. At that moment, footsteps were heard in the corridor. The medical round was approaching their cell. Johnson saw the familiar figure of Nurse Rachel. She stopped at their bars, holding a tray of medicines. "Good evening, Mr. Foster." Her voice sounded professional, but Marcus caught some special, velvety notes in it. "Your sleeping medication." Foster approached the bars. While accepting the pills, he momentarily held the nurse's hand, so quickly that the guard accompanying the round noticed nothing. But Johnson saw something small migrate from Foster's hand into Rachel's palm. After the nurse left, Foster returned to his bunk. He looked calm, but in his eyes appeared some new gleam, a gleam of hope. "You know what's the worst thing about prison?" he asked suddenly. "Not the bars, not the guards, not the heat, and not the disgusting food. It's that everyone uses each other here. Everyone tries to get something from others. Friendship, love, trust, everything here turns into currency." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Foster's words too accurately described his own situation. He looked at the photographs on the wall, smiling teenagers, the ocean, a happy family whose future was taken away in an instant. And now Price wants to take away this man's last chance at justice. The light in the corridor went out. Minutes remained until lights out. Johnson lay on his bunk, but sleep wouldn't come. Before his eyes stood his mother's face, alternating with the faces of Foster's children from the photographs. What is right, he thought. What is truly right? At night, Alex Baker couldn't sleep. He lay in the darkness, listening to Rachel's even breathing beside him, and thought about how his life had changed in recent weeks. 15 years of marriage, not a small term, but never before had he felt such a gulf between them. Every morning she left for work earlier and earlier. Every evening she returned later and later. And now these strange notes, secret glances, the special intonation in her voice when she spoke about Foster. Each such moment responded with a sharp pain somewhere under his ribs. The next morning, he arrived at the prison earlier than usual. The Arizona sun was just rising above the horizon, coloring the concrete walls of Sunny Canyon the hue of baked blood. Baker headed straight for the archives. He needed to learn more about Foster's case. The archivist, gray-haired Thomas Wilkins, looked at the guard with surprise. Something happened, Alex. No, I just want to check something. Daniel Foster's case, can you find it? Wilkins slowly rose from his seat and headed for the shelves. A few minutes later, he returned with a thick folder. Strange case, he said, handing over the documents. Very strange. Baker settled at a distant table and immersed himself in reading. Foster's story indeed raised questions. Financial director of a major investment company, impeccable reputation, charitable activities, 2 children. And then a sudden accusation of financial fraud, a lightning-fast trial, and an unprecedentedly harsh sentence, 25 years. Everything looked strange. The speed of the case consideration, and the fact that key evidence proving Foster's guilt mysteriously disappeared immediately after the sentencing. But what interested Alex most was the figure of the judge who presided over the trial, Richard Lawrence. He was a longtime friend and golf partner of Nathaniel Harrison, Foster's boss. And 6 months after the sentencing, he tragically died in a car accident on a deserted road. His car crashed into a concrete barrier at high speed. Found anything interesting? Price's voice sounded right over his ear, making Baker jump. The prison warden stood behind his back, and it was unclear how long he had been there. Studying Foster's case, sir. I want to better understand the inmates I work with. Commendable zeal. Price sat on the edge of the table. Just don't dig too deep, Baker. Some secrets are better left buried. There was a distinct threat in his voice. Alex slowly closed the folder, not averting his gaze from the warden. You have a wonderful wife, Alex, Price continued, looking somewhere into space. It would be a shame if her reputation suffered due to careless behavior. What do you mean, sir? Nothing special, just a friendly warning. Some things are better left as they are. Price rose and headed for the exit. At the door, he turned around. By the way, I've noticed that your Rachel has been spending too much time in the medical unit lately. Maybe she should take some leave, for her health. When the prison warden left, Baker sat motionless for a long time, looking at the folder with Foster's case. Everything was forming a strange picture. The deceased judge, the disappeared evidence, his wife's sudden interest in the inmate, Price's threats. Something was not right here, something much more serious than a banal romance between a nurse and an inmate. In the midst of the afternoon heat, when the scorching air trembled above the asphalt of the prison yard, Rachel worked in the medical unit, carefully avoiding her husband's gaze as he was on duty in the corridor. She sorted through patient cards, but her thoughts were far away. In the pocket of her lab coat lay a note from Foster, handed over the previous evening. She hadn't had time to read it yet. Too many eyes were watching her every move. The door to the medical unit opened, admitting another inmate. It was Marcus Johnson, Foster's new cellmate. He complained of a headache, but Rachel noticed how carefully he studied her while she measured his blood pressure. Your blood pressure is slightly elevated, she said in a professional tone. I'll prescribe you medication. While she was writing the prescription, Johnson unexpectedly spoke in a quiet voice. He's innocent, you know. Rachel's hand trembled, ink spilled across the form. She raised her eyes to the inmate, which read tension and uncertainty. What do you mean? About Foster. He told me his story, and I believe him. Rachel looked toward the door. Alex stood outside, talking to another guard. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. Because you're the only one who can help him, and because, Johnson hesitated, because some people want him to be silenced forever. A chill ran down Rachel's spine. She remembered a strange conversation with Price a week ago, his hints that some inmates know too much for their own good. Here's your prescription, she said loudly, extending the paper, and added in a whisper, in the chapel, after evening service. Johnson nodded and left. Rachel followed him with her gaze, noticing how Alex observed her intently. In his eyes, she read a mixture of suspicion and pain. Left alone, she finally took out Foster's note. Just a few lines written in small, neat handwriting. I have documents against Harrison and Price. They're partners. Price helped cover up the case and hide the real evidence. Need to transfer copies to my lawyer, James Kowalski. We have little time. Rachel felt her heart beating faster. She had long suspected something like this, but the reality turned out to be scarier. If Price was really involved in this case. She remembered his penetrating gaze, how he always appeared unexpectedly, as if monitoring her every step. Footsteps sounded in the corridor. Someone was approaching the medical unit. Rachel hurriedly burned the note over the sink and washed away the ashes with water. When the door opened, she was already sitting at the table, pretending to fill out the journal. Price stood on the threshold. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Baker." His voice sounded with feigned courtesy. "How is the work progressing?" "Everything is in order, sir." "Glad to hear it. By the way, I've noticed that you've been communicating a lot with inmate Foster lately." Rachel tried to make her voice sound indifferent. "He often complains of insomnia. I prescribe him sleeping pills." "Yes, yes, of course," Price smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "You know, some inmates like to manipulate the staff, especially women. They tell heart-wrenching stories about their innocence, try to evoke sympathy." "I know my job, sir." "I don't doubt it, and yet be careful. It would be regrettable if your professional sympathy led to unpleasant consequences." With these words he left, leaving Rachel in a state close to panic. She realized she needed to act quickly. Tonight, in the chapel, she would have to make a decision that would change not only her life, but also the fates of many other people. At the end of the corridor, Price stopped next to Baker. "Keep an eye on your wife, Alex," he said quietly. "It seems she's forgotten where the line between compassion and foolishness lies." Alex remained silent, watching the receding warden. Then he turned to the medical unit window. Rachel sat with her head lowered over papers, her shoulders trembling slightly. For the first time in all his years of service, Baker didn't know what the right thing to do was. Chapter 2: Conspiracy. In the expensive restaurant Copper Moon, 30 miles from Sunny Canyon, Victor Price met with Nathaniel Harrison, Foster's former boss. They chose the farthest table, separated from the main hall by a decorative partition. Harrison, a tall man with a clean-shaven face and eyes the color of tarnished silver, nervously fidgeted with his napkin. This meeting clearly caused him discomfort. "Foster is up to something," Price began without preamble, putting a piece of steak in his mouth. "My sources say he somehow got hold of documents." Harrison's face, already pale, came to resemble a death mask. "What documents? That's impossible. We destroyed all the evidence." "Apparently not all." Price set aside his fork and knife. "He's established contact with the prison nurse, using her to transmit information to the outside. If these papers get to journalists or the prosecutor's office." "We can't allow that," Harrison's voice faltered. "I paid you $500,000 to ensure such problems wouldn't arise." "That's exactly why I'm here," Price smiled, revealing teeth too white for his age. "I've already taken certain steps. His new cellmate is a reliable man. Foster will disappear quickly and quietly. Accident, suicide, take your pick." "And the nurse?" "That's no longer your concern. I'll take care of everything." Meanwhile, in the prison medical unit, Rachel methodically prepared for Foster's escape. For 2 weeks, she had been collecting necessary medications, hiding them in a cache behind a tile in the toilet. She compiled a list of required documents, planned the route. Each of her steps was measured and calculated to the smallest detail. Rachel understood that she was risking not only her career, but also her freedom. However, the more she learned about Foster's story, the more time she spent with him, the stronger her conviction grew in the rightness of her actions. She couldn't allow an innocent man to rot in prison while the real criminals enjoyed freedom and power. And there was also a chance to truly change her life. Rachel wasn't planning to leave her husband, But what if, thanks to this story, she and Alex could start all over, far from here, in a place not poisoned by prison walls and the hypocrisy of the system they had both served for so long? Johnson was also getting enmeshed in the situation and increasingly understood that he wouldn't be able to kill Foster. In 2 weeks of sharing a cell, he saw in his cellmate not a cunning financial fraudster, but a man whose life was broken by the system he dared to expose. In the evenings, they talked at length. Foster told about his children, about working at the investment company, about how he discovered his boss's machinations. There was no falsehood in his words, only the bitterness of a man who had been deprived of what he held most dear. "You know, Marcus," Foster said once, looking at a photograph of his children, "the scariest thing isn't that I'm in prison. It's that they're growing up thinking their father is a criminal. I have to prove my innocence for their sake." Johnson nodded silently. He thought about his mother who was fatting away in hospice, dying but continuing to believe in him. Price's offer once seemed like salvation: kill Foster, get early release, say goodbye to Mom. But now this thought only evoked disgust. One morning, as they were returning from the showers, Foster quietly said, "I know why you were assigned to my cell. Price wants me dead." Marcus froze in place. How did you guess?" "I wasn't born yesterday, Marcus. Besides, I have my own sources of information. Price and my former boss are old partners. They made millions on those machinations I discovered, and now they're afraid the truth will come out." Johnson sank onto the bunk. "Yes, you're right. He promised to reduce my sentence. My mother is dying, Dan. I just wanted to see her before she died." Foster put a hand on his shoulder. "I understand, but there's another way. Help me get out of here instead of killing me. I have documents proving their crimes. If I can get to freedom and pass these papers to the right people, Price and Harrison will take my place. And you'll get your freedom, legally." Footsteps were heard in the corridor. It was Nurse Rachel with the evening round. Foster quickly moved to the bars. While the guard was distracted by noise in the neighboring cell, Foster and Rachel exchanged barely noticeable nods. Marcus understood. These two had already formulated some kind of plan. And now he had to decide, to become their ally or still fulfill Price's assignment. That same night in the cell, a conversation took place that changed everything. Foster convinced Johnson, revealing to him the full picture of the conspiracy. "I have copies of the real financial reports," Foster whispered. "Documents showing how Harrison manipulated the data. There are fake contracts, fictitious accounts, double bookkeeping. There are even receipts for money transfers. Price's real name appears on the list of recipients. That's why they're so desperate to get rid of me." "How did you manage to preserve this?" "I'm not a fool, Marcus. As soon as I suspected something was wrong, I made copies of all the suspicious documents and hid them in a safe place. Now, I just need to get out of here and hand them over to reliable hands." Johnson thoughtfully shook his head. "And you trust the nurse enough to involve her in an escape plan?" "Rachel isn't like everyone else here." A special warmth appeared in Foster's voice. "She's the only one who really listened to my story. She's risking everything by helping me: career, reputation, freedom. And she's not doing it for money or gain, but because she believes in justice." "And her husband, Guard Baker?" "That's the most difficult part," Foster sighed. "She loves him, truly loves him. But Alex is a man of the system. He believes in rules, in order. For him, the world is divided into black and white, into criminals and law-abiding citizens. He would never understand that sometimes rules need to be broken for the sake of higher justice." Marcus was silent, thinking about what he had heard. He remembered his mother, her guidance. "Always act according to your conscience, son, even if it's difficult." But what does it mean to act according to conscience in a world where honest people are put in prison and criminals wear authority badges? "I'll help you," he said decisively. "Tell me what needs to be done." Foster nodded gratefully. Tomorrow Rachel will bring the final details of the plan. The escape is scheduled for next week, on the day the parole commission inspects. It's the perfect moment when there will be many outsiders in the prison. Did Price say anything to you about time frames? He's becoming impatient. Hinted that he wants to see results in the coming days. That means we have little time. Foster hid the documents back in the hiding place under the mattress. Thank you, Marcus. I know what you're risking. I'm risking no less than you. Yes, but I have no choice. This is my only chance to see my children and clear my name. Dawn was breaking outside the cell window. The new day carried with it new dangers and new hopes, but both inmates for the first time in a long while felt a strange inspiration. Now they were not alone in their struggle against the system. Chapter 3: Decision. Alex Baker hadn't slept for the third night in a row. He lay in bed, listening to the quiet breathing of Rachel sleeping beside him, and tried to overcome the doubts that tormented him. 15 years of impeccable service had taught him one thing: in prison, there's no place for half-tones. There are inmates and there's the law, and his job is to make sure a clear boundary is maintained between them. But now this boundary was blurring before his eyes, and, most frightening of all, his own wife was blurring it. During the day, he observed her working in the medical unit, outwardly as collected and professional as always. But something had subtly changed in her movements, in how she communicated with inmates, especially with Foster. Alex noticed these barely perceptible glances, accidental touches when passing medications, quiet conversations that ceased as soon as he approached. Each such moment responded with a sharp pain somewhere under his ribs. Meanwhile, in another wing of the prison, Price was unfolding his game. He summoned Johnson under the pretext of discussing his pardon petition. In the warden's office, as always, it was cool from the working air conditioner, and heavy curtains kept out the scorching desert sun. "Well, how is our business progressing?" asked Price, pouring coffee into cups. He deliberately added friendly notes to his voice, but his eyes remained cold and tenacious, like those of a lizard watching for prey. "I'm working on it," replied Johnson, trying to make his voice sound confident. "Foster has begun to trust me." "Time is running out." Price placed the cup in front of the inmate. "Your mother is probably counting the days. It would be a shame if you didn't get to say goodbye to her." Marcus felt nausea rising to his throat. He knew that every word of his, every intonation was now literally being dissected by this man with cold eyes. He thought about the documents hidden in Foster's cell, about the escape plan, about his dying mother. Options flashed before his eyes like frames of a black and white film. In the prison medical unit, Rachel prepared for the decisive stage of the escape plan. Everything had to be perfectly calculated. One mistake could cost not only freedom, but also life. Her hands trembled slightly when she thought about how she would have to, accidentally, leave certain doors unlocked on inspection day. She knew the guard's schedule by heart. 12 years of working in prison had taught her to notice the smallest details in the daily routine. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, Rodriguez, the laziest of the guards who often went away to smoke, was on duty in the Eastern Bloc. On Friday after lunch, the shift changed, the perfect time for a diversionary maneuver. And on Sunday, Alex usually took a day off. At the thought of her husband, her heart constricted. She loved him, truly loved him. For his honesty, principles, for how reliable he had always been. But now these same qualities had become a wall between them. How to explain to a person who faithfully believes in the system that sometimes the system makes mistakes, that justice and law are not always the same thing? Meanwhile, Foster and Johnson sat in their cell, carefully discussing every detail of the upcoming escape. In 2 weeks of joint imprisonment, a strange trust had developed between them, not friendship, but understanding, sealed by a common secret and a common goal. "Price is becoming suspicious," Johnson said quietly, rubbing his calloused hands. "Today he called me in again, hinted at deadlines, said it's time to finish you off. I think we have at most a week left." Foster nodded, smoothing out a worn envelope with photographs. "Rachel says everything is ready. We just need to wait for the right moment. Next Tuesday, the parole commission is coming. Commotion, many outsiders, the guards will be distracted." Marcus thought about his mother fatting away in hospice, about the freedom Price promised, about how easy it would be to simply fulfill the warden's order, one stab with a shiv under the ribs and all problems solved. But he also thought about Foster's children, who for years had grown up thinking their father was a criminal, about justice, which was worth more than freedom. Price wasn't used to his plans being disrupted. Sitting in his office late in the evening, he reviewed surveillance camera footage. Something was definitely happening between Foster, Johnson, and the nurse, but he couldn't catch them red-handed. Each step seemed perfectly natural: routine medical procedures, standard interaction between cellmates, routine work of the prison staff. And yet his instincts, honed by years of service in the correctional system, screamed of danger. And in the prison yard, Alex Baker observed the scheduled perimeter check. He had deliberately volunteered for additional duty to be closer to the medical unit. Over the past week, he had noticed several oddities in the guards' behavior. They seemed to deliberately look away when Rachel passed by Foster's cell. Perhaps his wife had bribed some of them, or was it something else? His reflections were interrupted by the sound of the medical unit door opening. Rachel emerged, holding a tray of medications. Their eyes met. Something like guilt flashed in hers, but she quickly averted her gaze and headed toward the cells. Baker took a step to follow her but stopped. Something held him back, perhaps fear of learning the truth, or perhaps reluctance to become the one who would ruin his own wife's life. At this moment, Johnson emerged from the warden's office accompanied by a guard. He looked tense, his gaze darting to the medical unit where Rachel had just disappeared. Alex noted this glance. All the threads, his wife, Foster, Johnson, Price, seemed like parts of one puzzle, but he couldn't put them together. In the cell, Foster and Johnson were completing the final preparations for the escape. The plan was risky but carefully thought out. They had discussed every detail dozens of times, considered all possible scenarios. Rachel was to leave the necessary doors open, distract the guards with a medical alarm, and provide them with civilian clothes. "As soon as the documents reach my lawyer," Foster explained, packing around the cramped cell, "there's no going back. Price and Harrison will be under attack. They'll have to defend themselves, which means they'll be distracted from us." Johnson sat on the lower bunk, handling homemade rosary beads, a talisman woven from shoelaces and buttons. "What if they get to us first? What if Price suspects something?" "That's why we need to act quickly." Foster sat down next to him. "Rachel says next Tuesday is ideal. The parole commission will be in the prison, lots of outsiders. The guards will be on pins and needles, but attention will be scattered." At this moment, Rachel passed through the corridor with the evening round. She lingered at their cell a bit longer than usual, pretending to check prescriptions in the medical chart. "Everything is ready," she whispered, not looking at them. "Tuesday, 3 o'clock. We start with a medical alarm." When her footsteps faded at the end of the corridor, Johnson turned to Foster. "If something goes wrong, if we're caught, then we'll all be in very big trouble," Foster finished for him. "But we have no choice. This is the only chance to restore justice." Marcus nodded. He thought about his mother, that he might never see her alive. But for the first time in a long while, he felt he was doing the right thing. In the medical unit, Rachel checked the plans for Tuesday one last time. Her hands trembled from tension. Tomorrow everything would be decided. Either they would achieve what they had planned and help an innocent man gain freedom, or she didn't allow herself to think about the other possibility. Suddenly she heard footsteps in the corridor. Her heart jumped. At this time there should be no one in the medical unit. Quickly closing the cabinet, she pretended to be filling out the journal. Alex appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing here so late?" he asked, looking intently at his wife. In the dim light of the medical unit, his face seemed gaunt and aged. 15 years of service seemed to have manifested as wrinkles on his forehead over these few weeks. Rachel felt her heart pounding wildly, but outwardly remained calm. Filling out documentation. Tomorrow is the scheduled inspection, you know. They always require a full report on the inmate's health status. Alex slowly walked through the medical unit, his gaze sliding over the shelves with medications over his wife's desk. "I haven't asked you before," he began quietly, "but now I must know. What's going on between you and this inmate, Foster?" Rachel froze. This moment had to come. She had known it from the beginning. But how to explain to her husband that her actions were dictated not by romantic feelings, not by frivolous infatuation, but by a desire for justice? How to tell about the documents, about Price's machinations, about an innocent man whom the system was grinding in its millstones? "Alex," she looked him straight in the eyes, "do you believe in justice?" "I believe in the law," he answered firmly. "And if the law is wrong, if the system we serve is being used to hide the crimes of those who should stand guard over justice?" Alex sank into a chair. He looked incredibly tired, as if physically feeling the world which had seemed so solid and understandable, falling apart before his eyes. "You talk like an exposing journalist, not like my wife. I've seen you with him, seen how you look at him, how you pass notes." "It's not what you think." Rachel approached her husband, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Foster is innocent. I have proof. Price and the people who put him behind bars, they are the real criminals. And so you decided to become a judge, take the law into your own hands." There was bitterness in his voice. "No, I decided to help the truth come out. Isn't that why we work here? For justice to prevail." Alex raised his eyes to her. "Do you understand that you're risking not only your career, if Price finds out?" "He already suspects something." Rachel sat beside her husband. "Tomorrow everything will be decided. I should have told you earlier, but I was afraid to put you before such a choice. Forgive me." In Price's office at this time, an emergency meeting was taking place. The warden had received alarming news from his informant. Tomorrow Foster was to attempt an escape. His people had detected suspicious activity around the prison. A car had driven by the gates several times, and in town, someone resembling Foster's former lawyer had been seen. "Strengthen the security," he ordered his deputy, a sturdy man with a military bearing. "Especially during the commission's work. Check everyone entering and leaving, and keep an eye on the medical unit." He approached the window, looking at the prison yard illuminated by guard searchlights cutting through the darkness like laser beams. Somewhere there, in one of the cells, sat a man capable of destroying everything he had built over years. Foster with his documents was like a time bomb. And now there was also this nurse and the cellmate whom he had entrusted to eliminate the problem. Price took Foster's personal file from the safe. For 8 years, he had kept everything under control. For 8 years, this secret had remained buried behind prison walls. He couldn't allow some financier and a sentimental nurse to ruin everything. "Bring Johnson to me," he ordered, "immediately." Meanwhile, in the medical unit, Alex had made the most difficult decision in his life. After hearing his wife's story, seeing the documents she had hidden, he understood. The system he had faithfully served for 15 years had indeed failed. The question wasn't whether his wife was breaking the law. The question was what was more important, the letter of the law or its spirit. "What are you planning to do tomorrow?" he asked Rachel. "Do you really want to know?" She carefully looked at her husband. "Because if I tell you, you become an accomplice." Alex momentarily closed his eyes. Before his inner vision flashed all the years of service, his impeccable reputation, the oath he had taken. And then he saw Foster's face, a man whom the system had turned into a criminal, Johnson's face, ready to risk his only chance to see his mother for the sake of justice, and his wife's face, a woman who turned out to be braver and more honest than himself. "Tell me everything," he said decisively, "and let's think about how to do this right." Outside the medical unit window, dawn was breaking. Less than 8 hours remained until the commission's meeting began. Chapter 4: Liberation. The day of the parole commission's meeting in Sunny Canyon Prison began as usual, with the morning roll call. But there was a strange tension in the air, felt by everyone, both inmates and guards. Unfamiliar people in suits roamed the corridors, commission members, inspectors, lawyers. Price personally greeted them at the entrance, exuding the cordiality and confidence of a man with nothing to hide. But deep in his watery eyes lurked anxiety. Something important was to happen today, and he sensed it. Alex Baker reported for duty earlier than usual. After the night's conversation with Rachel, he hadn't closed his eyes, thinking over a plan of action. Now, walking through familiar corridors, he looked at his work with different eyes. Each cell, each lock, each bar, everything that previously seemed part of an inviolable justice system now appeared as links in a chain that had entangled an innocent man. In the medical unit, Rachel prepared for the decisive moment. The documents that could destroy Price's career and free Foster were safely hidden among medical charts. At 3 o'clock, a contact was to arrive, a young lawyer, supposedly checking the conditions of inmate detention. He was to take the papers and immediately deliver them to the editorial offices of the state's largest newspapers. Foster and Johnson in their cell also awaited the appointed hour. They hardly spoke. Each understood that any careless word could betray their plans. Marcus handled his homemade rosary beads, thinking that he might never see his mother again. Foster sat on the bunk, looking at photographs of his children. Everything that was to happen today, he did for them, so they would know their father wasn't a criminal. Suddenly, footsteps were heard in the corridor. Someone was rapidly approaching their cell. It was a guard sent by Price. "Johnson, step out. The warden wants to see you." Foster and Marcus exchanged quick glances. Both understood Price had suspected something. Now everything depended on whether Johnson could convince the prison warden that he was still carrying out his assignment. In Price's office, Marcus felt cold sweat running down his spine, soaking into the orange prison uniform. The warden sat behind his massive desk, demonstratively shuffling through some papers, as if the inmate's presence didn't interest him at all. Finally, he raised his eyes, poorly concealed irritation red in them. "You know, Johnson, I'm disappointed, very disappointed. I gave you a simple task: remove one inmate. In return, I promised freedom, a chance to see your mother. And you—" He laid out several photographs on the table. In them, Marcus was talking with Foster in the cell, passing something to him, shaking his hand. "And you decided to play nobility." Johnson remained silent. He understood any word of his could be fatal not only for him, but also for the other participants in the plan. "Last chance," Price leaned forward, his face acquiring a purple hue. "Foster must die today, right now. If you do it, you'll get everything I promised. If not—" He paused. "I'm afraid your mother won't see her beloved son." At this moment, Alex Baker entered the office without knocking. His face was impenetrable, but in his eyes read the determination of a man ready to go all the way. "Sir, we have a problem in the medical unit. I think your presence is necessary." Price rose sharply. "What's there?" "Better for you to see for yourself." Alex remained calm, but his right hand, resting on his holster, trembled slightly from tension. As they walked down the corridor, Johnson noticed how Baker barely noticeably nodded toward the emergency exit, the very one that, according to the plan, Rachel was to accidentally leave open. Marcus understood. The guard had decided to help them. Now he just had to wait for the right moment. In the medical unit, organized chaos reigned. Rachel had managed to start a small fire by dropping a spirit lamp onto a stack of medical charts. Smoke filled the room. The fire alarm went off. Guards assigned to watch her were forced to help evacuate documents and medications. In the confusion, no one noticed how she passed a package with Foster's real documents to a young lawyer from the commission, who immediately left the prison building. Price instantly understood what was happening. his face contorted with impotent rage. "All inmates to their cells. No one gets out. Baker, you're personally responsible for Foster." But it was already too late. Under the conditions of the fire alarm and commission evacuation, confusion arose. Inmates lined up along the walls according to protocol. Guards tried to establish order. Commission members hurried to the exits. In this commotion, Foster, having received a signal from Johnson, managed to get lost in the crowd. Alex, pretending to search for Foster in the eastern wing, deliberately moved in the opposite direction from where the fugitive actually was. He understood. This was the end of his career, possibly even his freedom, but for the first time in 15 years of service, he felt he was doing the right thing. Rachel, still in the medical unit, diligently maintained the appearance of panic due to the fire. She bustled about, accidentally dropping boxes of medications, creating additional confusion. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Foster, having changed from prison uniform into a commission member's suit, confidently heading toward the exit. Price darted between floors, giving contradictory orders. His usual imperturbability had evaporated. He understood he was losing control of the situation. "Block all exits," he shouted into the radio, but it was already too late. The fire safety system had automatically unlocked some doors, and under evacuation conditions, it was impossible to completely close the prison. At some point, his and Foster's gazes met across the entire corridor. Price saw in the inmate's eyes not fear, not triumph, but the calm confidence of a man who knows that truth is on his side. The warden reached for his holster, but Baker, who happened to be nearby, seemingly accidentally pushed him, preventing him from drawing his weapon. "Sorry, sir," the guard said with feigned repentance. "Such a commotion." Johnson, observing this scene, understood. This was the moment. He deliberately created a bottleneck in the corridor, pretending to have a choking fit. While guards tried to pull him to the wall, a crowd formed of inmates and staff. Foster used this moment to blend in with the departing commission members. An hour after the fire alarm began, the situation in the prison started to stabilize. Inmates were counted and returned to their cells. Commission members had left the building. The fire in the medical unit was extinguished, and only then did it become finally clear Foster had disappeared. He had managed to leave the prison along with the evacuating inspectors. Price raged in his office. All his plans were crumbling like a house of cards. The phone on his desk didn't stop ringing. His informants reported that Foster's lawyer had already delivered the documents to several major state newspapers. By evening, his whole world was to turn to ashes. "Take them all," he growled into the receiver. "Baker, his wife, Johnson, everyone. I want to know who did what." But the investigation of the day's events presented him with an unpleasant surprise. Surveillance cameras showed only standard confusion during a fire alarm. Alex Baker flawlessly performed his duties, trying to establish order in the eastern wing. Rachel acted strictly according to protocol during a fire in the medical unit. Even Johnson hadn't done anything that could be considered a violation of the regime. Each played their role so naturally that it was impossible to find fault. The next morning, a scandal erupted. Newspapers were filled with headlines about corruption in the justice system, about evidence tampering, about collusion between the prison warden and a major businessman. The documents transferred by Foster proved to be irrefutable. A federal investigation was initiated. Price tried to flee but was detained at the state border. A suitcase with money and forged documents was found in his car. He tried to make a deal with the investigation, promising to name all accomplices, but Harrison preempted him, being the first to cooperate with the prosecution. Within a week, Foster's case was reviewed. All charges against him were dropped. Court experts discovered dozens of violations in the course of the original trial, from falsified evidence to jury bribery. New details of the corruption scheme involving high-ranking officials in the justice system and influential state businessmen came to light. Journalists dubbed it the case of the decade. Johnson received parole for assisting the investigation. He managed to see his mother, whose condition, as if by magic, began to improve after her son's appearance. Foster, using his connections in the financial world, paid for her treatment at the best clinic as a sign of gratitude for the help. Alex and Rachel Baker resigned from the correctional system. After an internal investigation of their actions on the day of the escape, no claims could be made against them. Formally, they hadn't violated any instructions, but both understood that their time in the system was over. One evening, sitting on the porch of their home in a Phoenix suburb, they made the decision to start anew. "You know, I never thought my career would end like this," Alex said, sipping cold lemonade. There was no regret in his voice, only a strange relief, as if a heavy burden had finally fallen from his shoulders. "Do you regret it?" Rachel laid her head on his shoulder, inhaling the familiar scent of his aftershave. Alex thought, looking at the sunset blazing with purple. For 15 years he had believed in the system, believed that by following instructions and rules, he served the higher good, justice. And it turned out that the very rules he so sacredly honored allowed criminals like Price to remain unpunished. "Not for a second," he answered, embracing his wife. "I finally know what real justice looks like." A month later, they moved to Colorado, where Rachel got a job at a regular hospital, and Alex opened a small private security firm. Their home in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains became a haven of peace, a symbol of a new life cleansed of lies and compromises. At the same time, Marcus Johnson reunited with his mother. She was transferred to a private clinic, paid for by Foster. When Marcus first entered the ward, his heart constricted with pain. On the hospital bed lay a fragile woman, dried by illness to the state of a transparent shadow. But in her eyes still burned that fire he remembered from childhood. "You've returned," whispered Eleanora Johnson, extending a thin hand with protruding veins toward her son. "Yes, Mom, I've returned." Marcus knelt beside the bed, pressing her fingers, almost weightless like autumn leaves, to his lips. "I always knew you were a good boy," she smiled. "Always knew it." Marcus didn't tell her about how he had almost become a murderer for the sake of this meeting, how he had balanced on the edge of an abyss. He simply sat beside her, holding her hand, listening to the quiet voice telling about neighbors, about the small garden near the house, about the world in which she had lived all these years while he was behind bars. Surprisingly, after his appearance, Eleanora got better. Doctors spoke of a miracle and unexplained remission. Marcus knew. It wasn't a miracle, simply his mother had always been a fighter. She had waited for him, and now that he had returned, she had a reason to continue the fight. 6 months after the escape from Sunny Canyon, Daniel Foster officially received the status of a free man. The federal judge handling his case publicly apologized on behalf of the judicial system for a flagrant case of judicial error and corruption. The day when he first met his children after 8 years without prison bars between them became the happiest in his life. Matthew, now a 16-year-old teenager with his father's inquisitive gaze, and Emma, a 13-year-old girl with his stubborn chin, looked at him cautiously. They barely remembered their father outside prison walls. "I know I've missed a lot," Foster said, breaking the awkward silence. "I missed your basketball games, Matt, and your dance performances, Emma. I missed your birthdays, school celebrations, first loves, first disappointments." He faltered, feeling a lump rising in his throat. So many irretrievable moments, so much stolen time. "But I never stopped loving you. Every day in prison I thought about you, prayed for you, dreamed of the day when we would be together again. And now I want only one thing: to be there when you need me." Emma was the first to break the distance. She stepped forward and hugged her father. Matthew followed her. And at this moment, standing on the Pacific Ocean shore, embracing his children, Daniel Foster finally felt truly free. Life after liberation turned out to be more difficult than he had imagined. 8 years, a huge term. The world had changed, technologies had advanced, former colleagues had scattered in different directions. But Foster didn't give up. His story received wide publicity, and soon offers for cooperation began to come in. Publishing houses wanted to publish his memoirs, production companies wanted to make a documentary, human rights organizations wanted to involve him as a consultant. He chose the latter, became a consultant for the Second Chance Foundation, helping released inmates adapt to life in freedom and fight against unjust sentences. His experience as a financial analyst proved invaluable for the organization, and his personal story, inspiring for many. It was in the foundation's office that he once ran into Rachel Baker. She had come from Colorado for a conference on the reform of the penal system, and seeing Foster, momentarily froze as if seeing a ghost. "Hello, Rachel," he simply said, extending his hand. "Daniel," she smiled, shaking his hand. "You look great, freedom suits you." They talked for several hours, not about the past, not about those dark corridors of Sunny Canyon, but about the present, about their new lives, about how each of them had found their calling after everything they had experienced. Between them remained no tension, no spark that had flashed in the prison medical unit, only warm respect for each other, appreciation for jointly experienced trials. "Alex knows I'm here," she said when the conversation nevertheless touched on the past. "He asked me to convey that he's glad for your release." Foster nodded. Strange, but he felt no animosity toward the former guard, only gratitude. On that decisive day, Alex Baker had made a choice in favor of justice, not the letter of the law. "And how is Johnson?" he asked. "Oh, you haven't heard. Marcus now works at a rehabilitation center for veterans. After his mother's recovery, he took courses as a social worker. Says he found his calling, helping those who, like him once, found themselves on the edge." Foster smiled. Another circle closed in this story. "And Price?" He could not ask this question. Rachel's face darkened. 15 years of maximum security. Irony of fate. He's serving in the very block where you used to sit. Harrison got 12 years but may get out earlier for cooperating with the investigation. Foster nodded. He felt no gloating, only a strange emptiness, as if a chapter of a book he had kept open for too long had closed. In the small coastal town of Santa Cruz, in a house overlooking the ocean, Daniel Foster began building a new life with his children. On weekends, they went to the beach together, had barbecues, talked about everything, making up for lost time. Sometimes awkward pauses slipped into conversations. Too much separated them. Too great was the gap of years. But gradually these pauses became shorter, and moments of mutual understanding more frequent. One day, sitting on the pier and watching the sunset, Matthew asked, "Dad, do you hate them, those who sent you to prison?" Foster stared at the horizon for a long time, where the sun was slowly sinking into the ocean, coloring the water the color of molten gold. "You know, son, I spent too much time thinking about them. Every day in prison I imagined how Price and Harrison got what they deserved, how their empires of lies crumbled. These thoughts helped me survive. But now," he paused, searching for words, "now I understand that the best revenge is a well-lived life. I'm free, I'm with you, and that's the only thing that matters." Matthew nodded, and in his eyes, Foster saw understanding he hadn't expected from a 16-year-old teenager, wisdom that comes only through trials. "I'm proud of you, Dad," he simply said. At this moment, Daniel Foster realized he had finally returned home, not in the material sense, but to where his heart had always found peace, in closeness with those he loved most in the world. In a cell of a federal maximum security prison, Victor Price sat on the lower bunk, staring into nowhere with a dead gaze. In 8 months of imprisonment, he had aged 10 years, become gaunt, turned gray, acquired a nervous tic. Each day for him was endless hell. He, who once controlled the lives of hundreds of inmates, had now become one of them, a number in the system he had so long used for personal enrichment. Strange justice of fate. His cellmate was assigned to be a former corrupt policeman, Garcia, convicted of bribery and abuse of power. He treated Price with poorly concealed contempt, just as Price himself had once treated faltered colleagues in the system. "You know what's the worst thing about prison, Victor?" Garcia said once, repeating without knowing it Foster's words. "Not the bars, not the guards, not the lousy food, but that everyone uses each other here. Everyone tries to get something from others. Friendship, love, trust, all this here turns into currency." Price didn't answer, but these words imprinted in his consciousness like a hot brand. He remembered how he had used Johnson, threatening him with his mother, how he had manipulated Baker through his wife, how he had turned Foster's life into hell to cover up his own crimes. In the depth of night, in the silence of the cell, broken only by Garcia's snoring and the distant footsteps of a guard, Price realized he had become what he had always despised, a broken man who had lost everything: power, money, freedom, and most importantly, self-respect. 2 years after Foster's release, an unusual meeting took place. In a restaurant on the outskirts of Denver gathered 4 people: Daniel Foster, Marcus Johnson, Alex and Rachel Baker. 4 people whom fate had brought together within the walls of Sunny Canyon and whose lives had forever intertwined in the struggle for justice. They talked about work, about families, about their new beginnings. Johnson told how his mother, against all prognoses, had recovered and now helped him at the rehabilitation center, working with veterans' families. The Bakers shared stories about their new life in Colorado, about the small house they had recently bought, about plans to have a child. Foster talked about his children, about work at the foundation, about the book he had begun to write, not so much about his imprisonment as about systemic problems of justice and ways to solve them. But behind these ordinary conversations lay something greater, an unspoken understanding that they had been part of something important, that they, each in their own way, had changed a system that seemed impregnable. To justice, Foster proposed a toast, raising his glass. "To a second chance," added Johnson. "To the courage to follow one's conscience," said Rachel. "To choosing the right side," concluded Alex. Their glasses met above the table, and at this moment each of them felt a strange peace, a feeling that, despite all the trials, everything had turned out exactly as it should have. Leaving the restaurant, they knew that they would most likely never gather together again. Their paths had diverged, each had found their own way, their own calling, their own truth. But the invisible thread that had bound them on that hot summer day in Sunny Canyon prison remained, as a reminder that even in the darkest system, light can be found if one believes in it strongly enough. And somewhere on the Pacific coast, in a small house overlooking the endless water expanse, Daniel Foster was finishing the manuscript of his book. The last lines he wrote sitting on the veranda, listening to his children laughing, playing on the beach. Justice is not an abstract concept, not a paragraph in a law textbook, not a word engraved on court facades. Justice is a choice we make every day, a choice to stand on the side of truth, even when it's difficult, even when it's dangerous, even when the whole world tells you you're wrong. I learned this truth in the darkest place of my life, behind the bars of Sunny Canyon. And now, looking at my children playing in freedom, at the ocean that knows no boundaries, I understand that for this moment, it was worth going through everything. He put a period and closed the laptop. Below on the beach, Matthew and Emma waved to him, inviting him to join. Foster smiled and stood up. The story had ended. Life had begun.